This is the fourth of my new videos. I'm going to drop the pretense that this is some kind of video diary, because it isn't really. It's far more about following an investigation. And the investigation is determined to a considerable extent by the comments that people make on my videos. I really don't know where this is going to lead. But I'm going to start with a comment that was made on my last video about suffering possible worlds in the multiverse. And it blew me away. It was again from one of my former students, who said that what I'd said about suffering in other possible worlds and the idea of there being possible worlds that are immeasurably worse than the actual world, as well as possible worlds that are immeasurably better, could be the foundation of a new religion. Which really made me laugh, because obviously I'm not in the business of promoting any kind of religion. But he said, look, this would be a new religion without God, but with heaven and hell. Heaven is, the wonderful possible worlds, the worlds where everyone is blissfully happy, and hell is the reverse. It's the terrible, terrible place that nobody would ever want to go to. But that begs the question, could you travel to other possible worlds? What would that mean? And when I first thought about this problem, when I wrote the Pathways program, The Possible World Machine, I wrote a story called The Possible World Machine, which is kind of based loosely on H.G. Wells' Time Machine, except that the nutty professor has a possible world machine. And the thing about this possible world machine is that you get into the machine and you can travel to various places, but you only travel around as a ghost. You can't interact with the local environment. You can't interact with other possible worlds. And I thought this was kind of necessary, that if you interact with a possible world, then it isn't the possible world that it is. I mean, if I travel to a possible world where the Twin Towers didn't fall, and I do anything there, I talk to a policeman, I go and have a coffee, then it isn't the possible world that it was before I visited it. And obviously if I did something as drastic as alerting someone and maybe somehow preventing the Twin Towers from falling, supposing that I could get anyone to believe me, well, obviously it would be a different possible world. And you could tell a similar story about going to hell. There's a Buddhist goddess called Kuan Yin, who is very popular amongst the same kind of people who would prefer Virgin Mary over Christ in Christianity. And the story about Kuan Yin is that she went down to hell. It's a beautiful story. She went down to hell and she turned the fires of hell into lotus blossoms. So she's the sort of person you pray to when you feel yourself to be a miserable sinner and you want to be saved. And she's very forgiving, etc. And, well, okay, that's wonderful. It's wonderful. But of course, in the picture of possible worlds all being real, there's a possible world where there's hell and everyone is burning furiously and in incredible torment. And then there's the possible world where Kuan Yin visits and everyone is happy, or not happy, but at least their torment is relieved. So nothing can be changed. All those worlds are just real. Okay. But couldn't you travel there anyway? Let's say that if I go to another possible world where the Twin Towers didn't fall, I disappear from this world and I reappear in the world 2015 where there's still Twin Towers. This is different from the time travel case, obviously. Someone else thwarted the plot. But now we've got 4 worlds. We've got the world where Jeffrey Klempner is giving a video and goes to the end of the video. We've got the world where in the middle of the video Jeffrey Klempner disappears instantly, and there's a little kind of pop as the air sort of rushes in to fill the gap. And then we've got the world where there are people sitting at a coffee shop somewhere in New York, and there's an empty table. And then we've got the same world but with another little pop and Jeffrey Klempner sitting at this table. 4 worlds. So, on this view, you could travel to possible worlds, you could interact with them, provided you recognize that you can never interact with the possible world you travelled to. You always turn it into another possible world, or it was already there, because all the possible worlds are equally real. But now we have a problem about personal identity. Because if someone tells me that there's a possible world where I'm going to disappear and reappear somewhere else in another world, what's that to me? Who am I? What makes it the case that my experience is the experience of someone who's travelled rather than the experience of someone who hasn't travelled? Because there are different Jeffrey Klempners. And once you get to that point, you realise that the whole idea of personal identity, if it wasn't messed up already, is completely messed up by the idea that you could travel to other possible worlds. We just don't know what it would mean. Personal identity is totally a retrospective concept. There is someone who thinks of themselves as Jeffrey Klempner, who's sitting at a coffee bar in New York. There's someone else who thinks he's Jeffrey Klempner, who's sitting here giving a video. That's it. There are 2 possible worlds with Jeffrey Klempner in it, and there's no distinguishing between them. And just as I talked about personal identity in the second of my old videos, What is Death? And so basically whenever you have body duplication experiments, there is absolutely nothing to make me be one of the duplicates rather than the other. So in this case, in this idea of travel to other possible worlds, there's nothing to make me the person who is in that other possible world. I can imagine whatever I like, but it's just not going to happen. But anyway, that got me thinking about something else that I wrote. A few years later, I was invited to write the afterword to a science fiction classic, a minor classic, by a writer called David Gerrold, who's probably most famously known for an episode he wrote for Star Trek called The Trouble with Tribbles. But this book is called The Man Who Folded Himself. It's quite short, 100 and something pages. And it was originally written in the 70s, and he rewrote it for sort of a new age, with some minor editing which wasn't altogether consistent. But I was asked to do an afterword, and I wrote an essay on time travel, which basically was completely consistent, or tried to be completely consistent, to the method of time travel that David Gerrold describes. Anyone who's looked at time travel knows that there's a huge problem about going into the past and changing the past. It's called the grandfather paradox. You go to the past, you accidentally run over your grandfather in the car that you hired, and now what happens to you? Surely you should cease to exist, because if your grandfather didn't exist, assumably before before your mother and father were born, whichever it was, say your mother, then you couldn't have existed. But in David Gerrold's time travel universe, what happens is a new world springs into existence. You leave the present, you go to another world, you kill your grandfather or whatever, and now the world is set off on a completely different path. It's another possible world. So you can save the grandfather paradox if you're prepared to countenance a whole massive number of possible worlds being generated. Every time you travel to another world, you create another possible world. And for quite a while I thought, well, this was a decent solution. As I said in my essay, you can't prevent the Twin Towers from falling. All you can do is go to a possible world and make it a possible world where the Twin Towers didn't fall. You can't change the past in any way. But then I was reminded of another possibility which I really hadn't considered at all. And this was another of my students, Craig Skinner, who did the University of London International Programme, BA. Craig Skinner is very clever. He's a senior National Health Service consultant in the UK. I don't know, he must be retired by now. He's in his late 70s. And he basically said, time travel is perfectly possible. You don't need possible worlds. You don't get into a grandfather paradox. All that happens is you cut something out of the stream of time and you paste it into the past. And it was always there in the past. And that's it. That's the solution. Just an example. What have I got? Some suitable object. This little stone heart that my daughter gave me for my birthday. So like a paperweight. I put it down here, and the very next second it disappears, just like that. And it reappears in the New York coffee shop in 1965. Nobody noticed it, and then a waitress came to the table and she saw, oh, somebody's left a nice little heart-shaped thing, and she took it home and kept it. And this happened in 1965. And that heart-shaped thing was subsequently, well, anything could happen to it. Anything, invent any story you like about what happened to it subsequently. Because it's perfectly consistent. This heart-shaped paperweight travelled through time. It was always there in 1965. It was there decades and decades before my daughter bought it for me on my birthday. And a similar thing could happen to persons. A person simply disappears and they reappear in the past. But they were always there. You can't change any known facts about the past. But you do have a massive problem about knowledge. And Craig Skinner said basically, okay, it's a problem, but it's not a logical paradox. And that is, and I talked about this in my essay, in my afterword to David Gerrold's novel. You go to a bookshop in the future, you take a book off the shelf, or let's say, according to Craig Skinner's account, a book mysteriously disappears from Waterstone's bookshop and reappears on your desk 10 years earlier. You then copy out the essay that you wrote, submit it to the editor, and it's subsequently published in that book, which then ends up on Waterstone's bookshop. And I asked rhetorically in my essay, well, who wrote the essay if I just copied it from a book from the future? And the answer is, nobody wrote it, that's just the way things happened. So you just have to accept that as a massive problem of knowledge. In other words, there's a huge gap in explanation, but it's not a logical paradox. So where does that leave us? You can travel to other possible worlds, provided you observe the restrictions I talked about, and similarly you could travel to other times. And all of this is assumed that it's you who are doing the travelling. And as I said, there's a serious question about personal identity raised there. As to what this all adds up to, I will only repeat what I said in my previous video, that I don't want to believe that possible worlds are real because of all the suffering that would involve. Suffering that could not be alleviated, logically could not be alleviated, because if you did try to do anything to help, it would just be making another possible world. That's a horrible prospect. As for time travel, well, maybe that would be quite neat. It would mess up science and physics quite considerably. I mean, we're not asking for a physical explanation. It would be consistent with logic, with or without possible worlds, depending on which interpretation you prefer. So I guess that's my answer, to the question about, could we invent a new religion with heaven and hell, etc. All these things are possible. That is to say, they're consistent with logic. But the real question is, what's the truth? Are possible worlds real? Is time travel actually possible and not just consistent with the laws of logic? What is the truth about this? And I'm now talking about ultimate reality. Not what we can imagine, not what the present laws of physics say is possible or impossible, but what is, in some sense, really possible. And as yet, I don't have a coherent answer to that question. And the only thing I would say is this, that there are a lot of people, and David Hume recognized this when he wrote the Treatise of Human Nature. There are people who want to believe all sorts of things because they're really cool. Wouldn't that be fantastic? And he called it being credulous. Actually, I think Dialogues of Natural Religion was the place where he'd really talked about credulity, human credulity. People will believe all sorts of things, but philosophy is about the search for the truth. And the question is, how do you determine what is the truth in this case? What counts as a proof, if there is such a thing, of a theory about ultimate reality? How do you test such a theory? And now we're thrown back on all the familiar possibilities that I talked about in my video on metaphysics and ultimate reality, which I'll have to revisit again, obviously. But that's all for now. Bye.